suppose that one of the benefits of being a part-time I did it twice. I must have gone the wrong way. To really get to mull over and meditate upon things internally. And I used to do that best when I was mowing a yard because it would drown everything else out and I could kind of focus and meditate on the things that were weighing on my own heart. Because I figured at base level, if a thing is beneficial to me, maybe it will be beneficial to somebody else. So the subject matter I have tonight is going to touch every human being, but it's definitely going to touch some of us much more than it does others. And regardless of which end of that spectrum you are on, I want you to take consideration of what that other side might be like. You'll find yourself on one end or the other probably. But take the time tonight to think about the person that might be on the other end of that spectrum, because I think it will help us in evangelism and self-growth and self-improvement. This morning's lesson was about light. It's a beautiful concept. Saves lives, spiritually and physically, right? My subject might be considered a little dark, a little gray, but inside this little cloud is a silver lining. And what I'm aiming to do, if I could have heeded this kind of wisdom much earlier in my own life, there would probably be more light within me. And I might have brought more light to the world in the past, because each day that passes is a day that we do not get back. So with that in mind, if you remember the scripture reading from a minute ago, this was a confession of Saul of Tarsus out of his own mouth that he was consenting to the death of Stephen. And you'll remember that, he was baptized in that context. He was there with Ananias, right? Arise and be baptized, wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. It is right there. But much later, Paul would write, I'm not worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. Paul had a word that does not exist in the King James Version of the Bible. Some of your newer versions will have it, if you want to check me on that. But the old King James doesn't have the word regret in it. But regret's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Not because I want to bring a gray cloud into your life, but because I would like to save you from having gray clouds in your life in the future. So I am speaking first and foremost to myself, and secondly maybe to my own children, because they get to hear me on a frequent basis when I try to tell them things about life. And you might think, well, the younger people, they've got longer to live. They've got more to learn from this. And I thought about that. And I thought, no, this is actually equally applicable regardless of our age. The longer we're around, the more things we've done, maybe the more things we can't undo necessarily. But the lesson, nevertheless, I think will be beneficial. So bear with me while I try to walk my way through this, okay? Regret comes from where? I decided, at least for my purposes, regret comes from a decision. We make a decision. There are things that we've said, or there's things we've left unsaid that wish we could go back to someone and have said it. Even if that was a matter of sharing the gospel or being a light, we might have some regrets about ships that have sailed that we never have the second opportunity to reach out to. Or there's those things that we've done or that we've left undone. And so we have regret because generally the decisions or the choices that we make. And I decided, again, for my purposes in this lesson at least, there's probably two kinds. There are the reparable kind. There are the kinds that you can actually set right. That would be Peter denying Christ at the fire because he lived to see another day and set that right. But he still regretted it. You know he did. He ran out weeping. The second kind is irreparable. That's Paul and Stephen. There's nothing that Paul could do in this life to bring Stephen back. No amount of remorse, no amount of regret, no amount of deeds done would bring Stephen back. No, granted, he knew full well and he understood the kind of death that Stephen died. He said, "You're a martyr." He understood where Stephen was. That had to be some consolation. But can you imagine the 3 days that Paul is just stricken with blindness, being led by somebody else to get up to Ananias and to meet with his conversion. What had to go through his mind for 3 days not being able to see? If it was me, I just know what I would be thinking about. I can't really assume what was in his mind, but I'd imagine that it had to be weighing on him. So our regret then is kind of rooted in our decisions. So I want you to think for a minute, again, depending on where you are in your life, it may vary. What do you make decisions for? And I thought, well, a lot of times we make decisions about what I'm preparing for. Okay, you're getting out of high school, you're getting ready for college, you're preparing for education, that you're preparing for a career, right? And then maybe you'll do the things that you do to prepare for a family. And later on in life, maybe you'll be preparing for retirement. And these are the things in life that we prepare for, and sometimes in and of themselves, separate and apart from the religious aspect of our life, we could still have some regret. We might take a job and just turn out that's not really the job that we wanted, and it kind of, made life sour for a while, but, that's reparable. We can get out of that and change those circumstances and the outcomes maybe of that decision. But that's how we usually get regret. Well, hindsight, they say, is 20/20, right? Just, but we can't go backwards. Paul couldn't go backwards and undo what was done. So if you're lucky in your decision making, you're not like me. I second guess myself on a momentary basis. Like if the double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, you are looking at him. I constantly fight and wrestle with myself, and I usually put off making decisions till whichever voice in my head finally got louder and argued the other one down. But it's a really long process for me. I don't have necessarily a lot of clarity in my decision-making process, and you would think that the more reflective you are and the more contemplative you are about your decision, maybe the less potential for regret that is there. But that depends on what information you use in that process. So that's not necessarily true. So I thought, rather than look at decision-making from what am I preparing for, let me try to look at it biblically about what am I being prepared for. And maybe this would help me in my decision-making. The heart of this lesson really comes out of two texts, and one of them is, it's the Romans 9, right? Hath not the potter power over the clay, right, of the same lump to make one vessel to honor and one vessel to dishonor. And this is in the context, of Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated, and Pharaoh was raised up with this hard heart and everything. And well, why then? Why? The question is there. Why does God find fault? You made me this way. Why are you mad at me about it? I'm a vessel, and you made me this way. And he says, but who are you to reply against God? So there was an error here with these people somewhere. So I want to illustrate the process a little bit. And some of y'all might actually have experience with this, and you could teach me 5,000 things. But, the person starts with a little lump of clay. Turns out it's an art even making the clay. We won't get into that today. But you throw the lump on there and you start shaping it and everything, and you get the shape that you want out of the clay. And at that point, hey, it still stands up on its own. You can't do anything with it because it's still soft, okay, and pliable. And if you're going to do anything else with it, you have to do it while it's in this state, okay? And I think this is important because when I look at this from the perspective of my life, I consider my youth. And I can remember my teachers would say certain things to me, or certain little doors would seem like down the hallway they're open for me, and maybe I could go that direction and explore that path, but I was too timid, too shy, too insecure, too whatever to even go down that path to begin with. And those doors don't continue to reopen necessarily. And as you pass time and you don't do that development earlier on, you sort of narrow down the things that you would be able to do in a function later on. And this is why, despite our best efforts to prepare ourselves for things, sometimes it doesn't work out. And maybe that's why, because God has the power over the clay. So when it's soft like this and you get it how you want it, you've got to try it by fire. And only then is it hardened. And at this point, when it comes out of here, you're not going to reshape it. It's not going to happen. So what you get when you're done is a teapot, right? And hey, if you like tea, that teapot's going to do the job. But for some people, maybe that teapot's not good enough. And this is where it gets interesting about the vessel made to honor and the vessel made to dishonor, okay? This is one of the things that was in my grandmother's collection, and I've really tried to zoom in on it because there are butterflies and inverted butterflies and birds and flowers and people, and all that's painted on there. The tea that comes out of this pot going to taste just the same as the tea that comes out of the other pot. Somebody spent a whole lot of time that I wouldn't spend to make this pot beautiful. But who am I to reply against the person that made that pot and say, why in the world did you invest all of that time and all of that effort into that pot? Because that tea is going to taste the same as that tea. But who am I to reply against the potter that had the power over that clay to make out of it what he saw fit to make out of it? It's his art, not mine. What value is my criticism? What value is my judgment? But the tea will taste the same. That's that practical part of me that I tell you all about all the time. And that's probably the third voice in my head. Maybe that's why I don't get anywhere. I've got the pro, the con, and the pragmatist right in the middle, and I never get past him. But that's the pretty pot. So, you make your tea and you're drinking your tea, and the next thing you know, you have broken the handle off your cup. Which, when you're drinking hot drinks, you need your handle because you might burn your hand. So you might think at this point, my favorite cup is useless. Unless maybe you go ahead and you break it the rest of the way and you make that table out of it. It's a whole new cup on the table, but that table is a tile mosaic made out of the bits and the pieces of said cup. And so the point is I, as a pot or a vessel in my life, I might get some bumps, I might get some bruises, I might get broken, I might get cracked, I might lose my handle, I might lose my mind. But God's able to make something out of me. And my whole life, I might have been preparing to be a cup. And maybe God had in mind, I'm actually going to make a table out of you. Any of you ever done that? That's the worst. What are you going to do with a cup like that? Depending on the hands of what artist you're in, it could wind up something beautiful like that, another tile mosaic. But a lot of times, we think, we've kind of got it figured out. I was going to leave the blank one there for a minute, not to confuse you. So this is what I mean. Consider some of the people in the Bible that God encountered, people that had plans, people that had a vision, people that were doing something, okay? Nebuchadnezzar, he was the head of gold, right? Great king, amazing king, doing big things. He had some plans, but God had some different plans for him. He might have been a little stubborn, and he wound up eating grass and growing some really long toenails and fingernails and long hair and all kinds of strange things. So you have that Nebuchadnezzar. You have our Pharaoh out of our Romans chapter 9, who hardened his heart and hardened his heart and hardened his heart and rebelled and rebelled and rebelled. I sinned this time, never mind. I'm going to oppress, and I'm still not going to let your people go. Jonah. Now, Jonah didn't wind up eating grass or growing long fingernails or destroyed by plagues in Egypt. He did wind up in the belly of a fish. What about the Saul of Tarsus that we talked about a minute ago? And what I realized is these particular vessels, God was so determined to have his way with those vessels that they didn't get a way out. You're going to do what I want you to do, or you're going to eat grass. You're going to do what I tell you to do, or Egypt is going to fall. Or in the case of Jonah, I told you to go east and you went west, and now you're in a fish. Would you like to go east now? And so they didn't get a choice. But, and I thought, well, maybe we actually, do we so much have the choice, or at least the choice that we think we have? But clearly, resistance was futile, and you can see the regrets. Read the stories of those people. You'll see the regret in there. Jonah had some time. Remember, just as the Son of Man was in the earth, right, into 3 days, 3 nights, so was Jonah in the belly of the fish, right? He had a few days, just like Saul of Tarsus' 3 days of darkness to think things over and get some clarity, right? Maybe before I make decisions, I should take time for clarity. See, you teach yourself sometimes when you talk out loud. I need to write that down while I remember it. So here's my question. How do we go from this resistance, like the people that we just studied, to acceptance? That is, from what I'm preparing to do to the point of what is God preparing me for? How do we really get mindful to tune in on that frequency and try to figure it out? Because unlike a prophet, God is not talking directly to us in that sense, right? But if we could do that, it would really help us to be prepared, quote unquote, when the time comes. And I say that, and the first person that comes to mind, hopefully, is Esther, right? For such a time as this. Now, let me ask you a question. If Esther was 50, would we have the book of Esther? Because what was Ahasuerus looking for? And the fairest of the fairest in all the land were there, okay? So such a time as this is like right now, not 30 years from now, right? In order for her to do what it was that she had to do. Joseph, if you've ever heard me talk, Joseph is my favorite. Now I want you to think about something for a minute. So Joseph is just a little brother. He's got 10 brothers out there working. It seems like he's just playing at home or something. Brothers get mad at him and they throw him in a pit and sell him off to some slave tradesmen. And he winds up in Egypt. He gets picked up by a guy named Potiphar. Don't know how long Potiphar has him. The next thing we know, Potiphar's running the guy's house. Like everything. Like, Potiphar's wife comes to him, right? And, hey, lie with me. And he's like, no, the master has put everything in my hands, under my purview. He has no idea what's going on in here because I'm handling it, except for you, right? That's the one thing that wasn't under his management, if you will. And I thought about it. We got thrown in prison. And then he comes out of prison. The next thing you know, he's running the nation of Egypt and saving how many ever lives. Where in the world he learned how to run a house? He didn't just learn that in the pit. He didn't learn that being a captive with the Ishmaelite slave traders. Where did he learn how to run a house? Probably back home from his father Israel. Where else would that knowledge come from? So this is what we see when we see somebody raised up and brought to a point. Started at a youth and came up. It didn't start for him when he was 40, It started for him long before that, when somebody was preparing him for something, or he was being prepared for something. And so, being something in his father's house, he was definitely something in Potiphar's house, and he was definitely something in Pharaoh's house. And I think that speaks to us to a degree. Look at Moses. We just got done studying all of Moses' life. He was 120 years old when he died up there on the mountain, right? God put him on the mountain. You remember that. Just talked about that not long ago. Remember Moses? It's like, all the little baby boys were going to be put to death, right? And so he gets sent across the water and he raised up in Pharaoh's house. And some 40 years later, he decided to throw away those pleasures of sin, and to go and be Hebrew openly, right? Here's my point. And then he's out in the wilderness. So he had 40 years worth of raised in Egypt to have 40 years out in Midian, only to pop back into Egypt for a minute to go back out to the wilderness again for his last 40 years. So if I'm counting right, 2/3 of his life, 67% of it, was devoted to the preparation for what God would have him to do. That's why I said young or old. It doesn't really actually matter, because a lot of that can be preparation. And remember, Moses was the broken-handled cup. Look, God, I can't speak. I can't do this. I'm not fit for this work. Well, who are you to reply against God? So God saw to it that job got done as well. Hopefully our personal favorite is the example set for us by Jesus, right? Who loosely had a 3-year ministry, who loosely was around 30 years old. So if you're doing the math there, 3 out of 33 years, that's 9% of his life. So 91% of his life was preparation for the work that God gave him to do. So no matter how old you are, you're not out of the woods yet. And in the case of Jesus, 30's young, okay? But 91% of his life in preparation for the work that he had to do. Let me ask you a question. Esther, Joseph, Moses, or Christ, what if one of them pulled a Jonah and just decided, I'm going the other way? Think about that. Mordecai gives you a little hint there. Well, God, if such a time as this, but if you do not, God will raise up deliverance from somewhere, right? And so, those clues are kind of in there. God's going to accomplish his will think the question is whether or not we're going to be a part of it and to what degree we aim to be a part of it. So there's no real capability argument. I'm too young, I'm too old, I'm too this, I'm too that. Might be chipped, might be cracked. I think we have to be open to being molded into whatever shape and then used in that shape. And people make all different kind of shape of pottery. All has a use of some kind. I would advise you, though, the sooner the better in regards to our regret, because there's less room for it. Just for a second, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verses 9 through 11 here. 1 Corinthians 6, beginning in 9. So he says, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, homosexuals, sodomites, thieves, covetous, drunkards, revilers, extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God." Look at this. "And such were some of you, but you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus by the Spirit of our God." So here you had some vessels that went out into the world, and it says, doesn't it, that, they got dirty. They needed to be washed, right? They needed to be cleaned, sanctified for use in the kingdom. But it's interesting that he says, "Such were some of you." Now, looking at this audience, I certainly don't want anybody to raise their hands, but I mean, were such some of you? Are they on the other end of the spectrum from you? That had a little more bumps and bruises, made a few more bad decisions along the way. Because it matters to understand maybe sometimes where other people are when you consider where you're wanting to bring them, where you're wanting to take them to in terms of Christ. One more real quick. Romans chapter 6, my favorite Romans chapter, you know that. Romans 6, we'll begin in verse 17. So he says, "But God be thanked, that though you were the slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered to you. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. Now I speak in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you presented your members as slaves of uncleanness and lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves of righteousness for holiness. For when you were the slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness." Now here it is. "What fruit did you have then in the things of which you are now ashamed?" That former lifestyle, that's the thing of which you are ashamed. Look, Paul did all that persecution in all good conscience up to that day. He believed that's what he ought to be doing as a zealous Jew, as a faithful Jew, was putting down the heresy and the blasphemy and the false teaching. He believed that he was doing something right. And then I thought again, just to tie this back to the regret and the idea of us being a vessel and our lifespan, service period. I think because of the brevity of life, regret is amplified, okay? And this is what I mean by that. You can see an individual, maybe a young adult, coming into mid to late 20s maybe, and starting to think already, I'm so far in that there's no way out. I've known of some people like that, they can't find their way out of the mess that they're in this life. Sometimes we get a little bit older and we might think, there's not enough time to recover from what I've done. Or you can't set these things right. And so my observation of people, biblically or otherwise, is one of three things kind of happens. Number one, they just dig in deeper. That's exactly what Pharaoh did. He could have turned around and went back the other way and done what God wanted him to do, but he kept digging in deeper. And then he was a little more invested each time, and then it was harder to back out each time. You can give up. That's exactly what Judas did. Judas gave up. He took the money back, he threw it down at their feet, and he said, "I have betrayed the innocent blood." But he gave up. And so he went out and he hanged himself. Our best example, I think, is probably Saul of Tarsus, Paul the Apostle, because he literally did a 180 literally, with full fervor and zeal that we're talking about on Wednesday night, right? Ran and persecuted the church, did his 180, and did exactly the opposite. So it is a matter of what we do with it. He didn't look at it and say, well, I've already killed people. I've already persecuted the church. I'm already so far, I might as well finish what I started, right? Or he didn't just give up, but he repented, right? He turned around, he did the 180, and he went the way that God would have him to go. And many other people turned. He wrote to them, right? And said, such were some of you. Maybe not of you, but they're out there somewhere, right? And I'm just going to let you know real quick, okay? As for me, I have regrets, okay? And they eat you on the inside. And so if you're young enough, like my kids, or maybe some of the rest of you in here, you don't want to carry regret because it's heavy. But there are things that I've left unsaid, and there's things that I've left undone. There are things that I have said, and there are things that I have done. And I would let you know that I've caused real harm to real people. And I live with that. And I still strive, I think much like Paul did, to remedy those wounds, because some wounds are deep, and it takes time. And I have actually seen healing, and I have seen growth, and I have seen the people even turn to God a little bit. And they were completely hardened from it. And I can't explain to you what that does to the inside of me. Because you have a tendency to look at yourself, I think, like Paul did, like I'm not worthy of the grace of God for the things that I did. But then when you get it anyway and you realize that, it has a totally different hit on you than if you're not bearing the regret and the sadness that goes behind it, right? But these are real realities in my own life, okay? And Paul would say, what he did ignorantly in unbelief. I didn't even do it in unbelief, okay? I knew better. And then so your question is then, why, Jesse, would you do those things? And the question's easy, because I gave up. Because what happened was I failed, and then I failed, and then I failed again. And you're like, why should I even get up and dust myself off and keep going? Because I'm just going to fall again. And that practical side of my mind says, why bother? And I would tell you that that's Satan talking. Satan is 100% behind guilt. He's 100% behind regret associated with guilt. And he doesn't need to be one of the voices in your head. And this is, again, where it's therapy for me to say that out loud in front of you, because I need to hear myself say it. He will use it against you. And my problem is there's more and more inaction in my life where I should be taking action because, I'm just afraid I'm going to mess something up again and just have more regret. And so my decision-making becomes indecision-making. And that's kind of where I am a lot of the times. But, by the mercy of God, I'll just let you know, I was that shattered cup. I got shattered. I got broke. The beauty of it is when God's mercy comes in and you get picked up, you're never going to be a coffee mug again, okay? But you can be repurposed. God can still use you. God can still use me. And we can't sit around dwelling on the what could have been or what might have been, because only God knows. If I could go back and listen to my elementary and middle school teachers and take a different path from the people who are actually in my life trying to guide me and give me some direction, because I didn't listen to them, because I didn't listen to anybody else either. And so who knows where I would be at this point. But that's not a reason for me to just give up and exercise more of my indecision and not get anywhere in the future. Because as long as I'm here, I surely can do something. Because you can still drink out of a cup with no handle. I've done it. Living proof. Okay? No, can't change the what could have been. So what about the what will be's? And see, that depends. And that depends on if you're going to be resistant and you're going to take a ship going west and wind up in a fish, or if you're going to go east where God would have you go. And everybody's life is different. Your opportunities that are in front of you, the doors that are open in front of you, the people that are nearest to you, the people that you cross paths with, I may never see or meet. And so we have to take those when they're there, because, that will lead to regret. Matthew 25 is that, and Matthew 7 are all you need to know about regret in the day of judgment, because, Lord, when did we see you naked or hungry or thirsty or in prison or whatever? And he says, well, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Matthew 7 for me is even scarier. Verses 21 through 23 there, right? Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. And so you get down the couple verses later, and he's like, you need to depart into the everlasting fire prepared for his devil and his angels. But there are so many people that would look at him and still say, he's the Lord. He's the Lord. But that context tells me a lot of them are not going to be there. That's scary, because there's a lot of people who know who God is. They're under full belief that they know God, and apparently they don't. That's the scariest 3 verses in the Bible for me. That's scary. And it makes me real contemplative of my position all the time. So anyway, what will be in the future, that's just going to depend. That's going to depend on if we resist or whether we accept the things that are before us. But like I told you a minute ago, regret is a heavy burden, and I don't want for anybody to exercise their spiritual strength and get really buff because they carry around a bunch of regret or guilt. Give a lot of thought, a lot of prayer, a lot of meditation, 3 days of darkness, if you will, that came out tonight, before you make those kinds of decisions that can have that kind of bearing on your life. Some decisions are really, really small. I understand that. But we're talking about things that would change your trajectory and where you might wind up in this life or in the next life. Okay? So I encourage you, I would urge you to be in tune with those little things that are out there and what God is trying to do with you. And think about it and look for those opportunities. I would also encourage you and urge you just to be faithful. When you slip up and you feel guilty, Satan's got ammunition for next time. And it would be really, really good to give Satan less ammo, okay, if you know what I mean. So the question for you tonight is, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to resist tonight and leave here with more regret that you didn't heed the call when it was presented to you? Or will you finally accept what we sing in the song all the time, let him have his way with thee? Good song. If I got here earlier, I would have requested that one probably. But I want you to think about that, because I don't want you to have regret. I don't wish it on anybody. I wish I didn't have as much as I have myself. I am thankful that I create less of it now than I used to, but it is a permanent stain and it doesn't go away. Just ask Saul of Tarsus, right? Do you have any need tonight? Let it be tonight while we stand, while we sing.